Continuing on then, right? So far we have our models in place. We have our migrations are all updated to work with SQLite. In fact, the whole system is set to work with SQLite now. We have our DB contexts and we're all set to carry on further. Now, you might remember from when we did the mask demo that the next thing I did after getting the database created was I actually went in using our little tool here, right, to the database and I actually manually added a bit of data in, right? Yeah, especially if we're going to be dropping and recreating this database over and over again, we don't want to have to manually do that. So the tutorial that I've asked you to do to begin with does go through the process of seeding data, and we're going to do the same thing here. Now, in the tutorial, they put the code for this inside the model folder, but to me, it just makes sense to put it inside the data folder. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to come in here. I'm going to right-click, add a class. I'm going to call it MO for Medical Office Initializer. All right, there we go. So it'll be a static class because it really is just a worker doing some work for us. So I'm going to make that a static class. And, well, I'm going to just get my code and put it in place. Okay, there we go. All right, so inside this class, I have this static method called seed, right? We inject the application builder, we go and we get through the service provider, our medical office context, and then we have a try catch, right? Always good practice. Anytime you're working with the database, wrap things in a try catch. Additional logic, right? We check to see if there's any data in each table before we go to add any, right? That avoids running this code and reinserting data if there's some already there. Now, why are we starting with doctors? Well, think about this, right? This goes right back to what you experienced working with databases right in term one. If one table depends on another table, right? For example, patients depends on doctors, okay? The many side depends on the one side in a one-to-many relationship and so on. Well, you have to have things there in the correct order, right? You can't create tables that relate to a table you haven't created yet. Same with data. I can't put data into patients unless I actually have doctors in place because, well, that's how the one-to-many relationship works. So I have to pay attention to the order that I do things as I see data as well as I did when I was creating objects, right? Okay, so I check if there's any records in the doctor's table. If there's not, then I know I'm free. I'm starting fresh and clean. I'm free to add some sample data here, right? Just some testing data to start with. So I've just got a few. Notice I can leave out the middle name on this one record because it's not required. Okay, so we're using, by the way, this is, of course, our DB context, our DB set. And so our DB set has a number of methods, one of them being add range, right? Add range allows us to create a series of objects and add it all in one go, right? I mentioned that and emphasize it a bit because if there's a problem with any one in the range, the whole thing fails and none of the data gets inserted, okay? Okay, so we save changes here and away we go. All right, now, then I can free to go on and do the same thing for patients, right? I just check if there's any data in the patients. If there's not, then we'll go in, we're going to use add range again. So I've got some hard-coded values here that I've done. The main thing I want to point out here is for the foreign key. It is true, right? First time running this, okay, Gregory House is going to get Dr. ID of, you guessed it, 1. Doogie Howser would be 2, and Charles Xavier would be ID 3, right? So I could hard code down here like 1, 2, 3, etc., but it's not a good practice, okay? What we should always do is we should do a query to go and find out, okay, the actual ID of an existing parent record, right? So we do that with a link query. So we go to our context, we go to the doctor's DB set, and we'll find this method first or default, right? And then we can specify here that the first name matches this, last name matches that, etc., whatever we want, right? Some criteria, if you didn't really care, you could just take the first record, right, period, and that was that. But anyway, then we go, once we get that object, we go .id, and that will give us the primary key, that integer ID, that's the identifier for the doctor, and we can use that to assign a value to the foreign key here in the patient, okay, the doctor ID. So that's what we have here. So I've got a couple going to Gregory House, one going to Doogie Howser, and one that's assigned to Charles Xavier, right? So that's where all this data comes into play. Then we save changes, and that's that. Now I mentioned about the try catch. right? I don't have much in the catch here, just basically writing a line out to the debug window with the basic exception of our EX object here to get the message. But you know what? What we'll often do is we'll often set a breakpoint. If you're not seeding any data, or you might find that data goes into some entities but not others, then clearly there's a problem happening. Now you can go and look for it, okay, to see what message was written out. But what I actually usually do is I just set a breakpoint right here. So if data isn't seeding properly, set the breakpoint. Next time you run it, right, you'll actually stop at the breakpoint and away you go. So maybe I'm just going to do this on purpose. I'm going to say, well, I think the email is required, so I'm going to comment this one out. So that this should fail first time I run it. And we'll have a chance to see our breakpoint working. Okay, that's just setting up the demo for later. But actually, how does this code get called, right? Well, let's come back here to our program, right? Remember, this is the code that runs when we first start the application, okay? We get our builder here, our web app application create builder, and then we do all this work before we actually call this step to actually build the application, right? That's where we can add all different things to our services, our DB context, and so on and so on. We'll be adding more and more objects as time goes on in here before we actually call .build. Then there's some code getting general things set up, depending on the environment, what are we using for endpoints and so on. We're using redirection, static files that allows us to access the files that are stored in our www root folder, right? Routing, and of course here we have that default route. Now I've mentioned the default route before. You can actually set up multiple routes if you wanted to or needed to, but I've never actually had to in my own experience, right? So here's why we can specify the URL with controller / the name of the action and optionally / the name, or sorry, the ID number of a given record. So if we want to edit, right, maybe we have a controller for widgets, okay, we want to edit, so the action would be edit, and the ID of the widget we want to edit was 23, then it would be the value that we provide here for the ID would be 23, right? So that's just a default. Now, if we don't provide values, okay, it assumes that home is the controller we want, that index is the action we want. Even if it's a different controller, if we don't specify an action, then it will assume the default value of index, right? And away we go. Okay, so that's all the code that's here now. But here's where I would put the code then to finally call our seed data to be inserted, right? I usually do it right at the end, okay, just before we actually call run, right? So I'll call my medical office initializer, that's my class. It'll be a seed operation, and I have to pass in the app. Well, that's okay, we already have the app. That's the object that we created right here when we built the application, right? There we go, and that gives us everything we need to actually do that. So next time I run, it will actually do that. But let's actually get our controllers and views in place as well, right? No point trying to see data if I can't actually see anything on the screen. So I'll do that next. We'll add our controllers. Make sure you choose MVC controller with views using Entity Framework, right? So I'll do, first of all, my doctor. Using my medical office context, I have all my check boxes checked here for the doctor's controller. And it will, of course, also scaffold the views. Now, I should have mentioned, probably a good practice is to do builds regularly. Now, you might have noticed there that it actually did a build as part of the scaffolding process. It wouldn't have finished scaffolding unless it passed the build. But, you know, it doesn't hurt to do your own build as well. Okay, we'll add one more controller for patient, right? So we have doctor, we have the patient. So we'll get the patient's controller. And this should only take a moment or two. Oh, and by the way, something I went ahead and did already because I hate to forget it. I talked about this in our previous demo. See, I have the www root open here, and here's our site CSS, right? So I already added this little bit here. This just gives a margin, a small margin underneath each form group, okay? It just affects how things are, you know, I find they're a little too tightly packed together when you're putting data entry in a form. So I like to do that in my CSS for the site. Okay, so I just want to mention I'd already done that. Okay, so we actually have our controllers, but how do we get to them? Well, let's do that now. Under Views, Shared, layout, here is where we have that nav bar up in the header of the page, right? So right now we just have the two links, home and privacy. So I'm going to take this one, I'll maybe make it the doctors controller. Oh, and this can be the index action. And I'll just call it doctors. I don't feel bad about stealing the one for privacy because I pointed out there's a link to the privacy control action of the home controller right down in the footer here as well. Okay, so I'm going to steal this, copy paste, and have another link up here for patients. Okay, all right, so the first time I run this, it should seed the data, but of course I've thrown a wrench into the works here. Oh, you know what I forgot? I forgot I'd run it once already. I'm sorry. So there was already data in the database. So, so much for my demo of seeing the breakpoint. Because it didn't hit the breakpoint because it didn't actually try to insert any records because I already had records in there. Darn. Hang on a second. Now, I'm not recommending that this is best practice or anything like that, but something we can do as an option here, right? I can delete and recreate the database with every restart, okay? So this will ensure that the database is deleted, right? See, I have my context object, so I can just say ensure deleted, and then I can say ensure created, right? So that just guarantees that I've deleted it and recreated it before I try to actually seed the data. Now, you might put this code in and maybe comment parts of it out. Maybe you just want the ensure created, right? There, depending on what you're doing later on. Actually, we don't really need either of them unless we want to make sure that it is deleted first. But by putting that in place, it just means that every restart, we start with a fresh copy of the database. Probably not what we want in most situations because, of course, what's going to happen is it's going to mean we only ever have our seed data. So if you experiment with putting a couple new records in, next time you restart, they'll be gone. You'd have to put them in again. So I won't leave it there long term, but I wanted to just make sure that we actually had a chance to do that. And now we can see, aha, all right, so here's my exception. So I can examine it down here, right? I can look at the inner exception. And we can see here, there's the message, not null constraint failed, patient's email, right? Ah, there we go. Now notice I can get that right by hovering over here as well, okay? And then I can find out exactly what's going on. So if any time you're not seeding all the data as you expect you should, right? Then that's the easiest thing. Just set a breakpoint here and come and have a look at what the specific message is. It doesn't always tell you exactly which record, right? In fact, it's not in this case because look, okay, we've got 4 patients we're adding. Now, it happened to be the last one, but it could have been any of them that I wasn't supplying the email address for, right? And remember how this add range works. All 4 gets inserted at once, right? When we go to save the data. If any one of them fails, the whole thing rolls back, so to speak. So, these might have been inserted already, but it's like a transaction. They get rolled back or taken back out. The whole thing has to succeed or none of it does, right? There we go. Now we've taken that commenting out so that all of the records should have what they need. So we're just going to go ahead and actually run this again. Now I'm set. Oh, you might have noticed I've set that for IIS Express as the browser. We'll talk about that in a moment or two. Okay, so sorry it opened on my other screen. So here we are. Notice we have a secure connection. I have my little lock, right? If I go to doctors, there are my doctors. Here are my patients, right? And we're getting a fair bit from our data annotations we had. Notice how the emails are actually showing up as links, okay, with a mail to link, so I could click on it and open up my email application, right? If I click create new, here is all the data. I can click create, and here's all the feedback that I'm getting. Now this is actually running client side, right? So it didn't post back to the server. It actually client side did all this validation. And notice that this first one can't leave the OHIP number blank. But if I start typing a value in, it immediately satisfied that validation requirement and has gone on to the regular expression, right? The OHIP number must be exactly 10 numeric digits. Oh, okay, I can't type letters, only digits, 4, 5, whatever, 6. And if I put an extra letter in, well, then it'll never be happy, right? There, now I know I have enough because it satisfied it, right? And so on. I'd actually have to go through and do all this. I can leave the middle name, date of birth. I wish. No, actually, I don't wish. I like being the age that I am. I'm happy with that. So 5 visits, phone number 905-555-1212, right? Email at niagaracollege.ca. So I know there's validation that it is a valid email as well, just by setting that data type. Now here's the first one that's really standing out here. We only have first names in our drop-down list here for the doctors, right? I don't have the full name, so that's probably not something that's perfect. Let me click this create, come back here, right? Even notice that I kind of didn't take time to look at it before. See where it says doctor, this column, it as well is only showing, okay, the first names, right? So that's not great. Now, we do have a lot of good stuff coming from our data annotations where we have all these nice display names going up here. We have this nice formatting of the dates and so on and so forth. Phone numbers could be better. So that's something we're going to have to address. And this issue, of course, of the doctor's names and things like that, we're going to have to deal with that as well, right? Back to the list. Let's just click edit, right? And that gives us the form with everything there. Now, mind you, if I take out something here, then I should get my validation messages right away and so on and so forth, but I can just go back to the list to cancel. All right, so that's good progress. This is a shorter one. Oh, maybe I'll deal with this. I talked about the fact that this is a secure connection, right? I'm just going to stop running for a sec. How does that all happen? Well, see, we have our choices up here of how we want to run it, okay? You should be aware that there are 2 different web servers we can use. Now, I had this set for IS Express, but if you do either of these 2 options where it just says HTTP or HTTPS, those are both using what is called the Kestrel web server. It's just a command line based little web server that is built into Visual Studio, right? So we don't have to spin up the whole IIS Express. If we don't want to, we can just use Kestrel. And it's maybe a little faster, right? You might notice a little command window open in the background. If you don't worry about it. It doesn't really matter, right? But you know, it's a good development tool, right? Maybe not as full featured as IIS Express. There might be a point in time where you definitely want to switch to using IIS Express to diagnose certain things. But for the most part, you can usually just pick. So this is a way to handle whether or not you have a valid security certificate on your system, right? If you can just select HTTP and it runs it in without a secured connection. Sorry, here we are. I have to change that setting in my browser here. It always opens a new tab every time I run. But anyway, so you see it's not a secure connection, right, for this particular one. So I'm going to close that. Whereas if I do the HTTPS, then I will get a secure connection when I run the application in the Kestrel browser, right? Once more, it's opening. So here's the last one I opened. So it's not secure, and this one is secure, right? Okay. All right. Let's try one more. Okay. How about IS Express now, right? So well, actually, I already showed you that this is going to come up with a secured connection at this point in time. So sometimes students run into an issue on a computer where they're having a hard time getting a secure certificate for a secure connection set up and working. So you may need to, as you go from computer to computer, want to just, rather than dealing with a secure connection, you just want to run it without that for now, because we aren't really worried. So how do you do that if you want to use IS Express? Easy with Kestrel. You just pick secure or not secure. With IS Express, what we have to do is come to the debug menu, go right down to the bottom and come to Debug Properties, right? This opens the launch profiles, among other things, right? So the profiles are already set for these two. We don't need to worry about that. But for IIS Express then, in the launch profile, come way down. I'll actually put up a tip in Blackboard on how to do this in case you don't remember where it is in this video. Here's this Use SSL. So if I uncheck that, next time I run with IIS Express, it will not be a secure connection, right? So I'll just save that. We're on IIS Express. And boy, I should have lots of tabs in my Brave browser open. And this one is not secure, right? There we go. Whereas that one is. And they're both using IIS Express. Okay, there we go. So that's my discussion. I'm just going to put it back because I'm usually going to use a secure connection. But I did want to just share that with you, how you can get around that issue if you're having a hard time getting a valid certificate in place. All right, we're going to carry on in our next video.